of the major international countries to join in sanctions. And the problem was that this was one of the poorest countries on earth, run by a government that didn't actually govern, a government that didn't care about the economy, didn't care about the well-being of its people, really just cared about its own power and the imposition of Sharia law. And so the idea of sanctioning this country is totally, it's almost an absurdity. But that is the policy that the Clinton administration pursued first and foremost. The second element of the policy was they were still trying to kill bin Laden. They had cruise missiles on ships in the Gulf area and south of Pakistan. They were trying to organize tribals, they were trying to organize Massoud, they were trying to do all sorts of things to kill bin Laden. But the point is, they failed to understand that they were not just dealing with one man, they were really dealing with a movement which had taken root in a country that had now, in a sense, helped take over the government. They refused to draw that conclusion. Now, in order to actually do anything serious on the ground, the Clinton administration would have had to talk to the Pakistani government, to the Pakistani military, and had to sit down with them, basically, and say to them, roughly at this time of the hijacking, between mid-98 and early 99, we would have to say, look, folks, this man, bin Laden, has caused damage to American interests. He is causing damage to a lot of people's interests. He threatens the Saudis. He threatens everybody he can. He may be a pipsqueak, but he seems to have taken over a country. And it's a dangerous situation for you as well. It's time for you, the Pakistanis, to stop coddling the Taliban. Afghanistan is a landlocked country. You can't get supplies in or out except through Iran or through Pakistan. And the Iranians were not exactly very friendly with the Taliban at that point, for reasons I've stated. And so you needed the Pakistanis on board. And you needed the Americans to go to the Pakistanis. And they didn't do it. I talked to the chief of staff at the time, General Karamat. He was the one who said to me, you Americans needed to come to us and ask us to change our policy. And we didn't do it. Why didn't we do it? Well, Bill Clinton had, his foreign policy on the whole was, in some areas things worked well, and at the end of the administration, what he did in the Balkans was a fairly smart thing in Kosovo, to save Kosovo. And in a way, what he did in Bosnia was a half measure, but it was better than no measure. But in other parts, in many parts of the world, the whole issue was, is there a constituency? Is there a lobby? Is there a political interest I have there? And if so, I'm going to go in that direction. And that's what Bill Clinton basically did. It was a kind of foreign policy on the whole that was controlled or highly influenced by lobbies, by constituencies, and by groups in Congress. So in this case, the group in Congress happens to be the current leadership in Congress, by the way. And they did not want to talk to Pakistan and improve relations with Pakistan. They basically wanted to sanction Pakistan. Pakistan had exploded a nuclear device. It was testing rockets, as was India. And they felt that the only thing to do was to go for sanctions. And that's what Bill Clinton did. Musharraf came to power, overthrowing a civilian government of Nawaz Sharif that actually was cooperating with the administration at the very end. And Musharraf's position was, if Nawaz wanted sort of anything but Nawaz, if Nawaz was trying to curb the Taliban, if he was listening to the Americans, I'm going to do just the opposite. And so Musharraf's time in office basically turned into total romp for the Taliban. The U.S. imposed sanctions. The Pakistanis circumvented them. The U.S. asked Pakistan to stop supporting. The Pakistanis stepped up their aid. So from that point until the end of the Clinton administration, there was really nothing to be done. The die had been cast. The story was basically over. Now, bin Laden, as you know, then organized in the year 2000, October 2000, through proxies in Yemen, the attack on the USS Cole. Bill Clinton decided it was October, the elections had not yet taken place. He was a man who hated to use force anywhere, anytime. And he basically demanded that the CIA provide perfect intelligence to prove that it was bin Laden behind it, as if there was a lot of other possibilities. And essentially, and then he did nothing. So in a sense, what the signal being given to bin Laden and the Taliban at this point, almost throughout, was that the United States really was not going to act, not going to do it. So this is pretty much the end of my story, but I'll just tell you some of the summary. I really began this as an attempt to look at the journalism of the 1990s in Afghanistan, and I found pretty much a vacuum. But I found myself then looking at the actions of the U.S. government. And looking back at the Clinton administration, for anybody who's nostalgic for it, I think we just have to remember that the Clinton administration was on the whole, in the foreign policy area, was guided much more by political concerns than it was by the national interest, as we might define it. And that, it was on their watch that many of the preparations took place for 9/11. You can't say everything. The Bush administration came in and decided, just like Clinton did in his time, anything but Clinton. If Clinton was going to be shy of using force, the Bush administration, as we have seen, was going to use it wherever it wanted to and whenever it thought it was appropriate. If the Clinton administration was focusing on terrorism in the sense that they wanted to eliminate bin Laden, the Bush administration basically, as we know from the testimony to the 9/11 Commission, was going to basically almost ignore all that advice. And the Bush administration decided, as we know after 9/11 especially, to use 9/11 as a political turning point and to use it in a very partisan way against the Democrats in order to get themselves reelected, to get Congress reelected, and it turned 9/11 into kind of a battering ram, a political battering ram. So what we have here, and this is my conclusion, is that we ignored Afghanistan. We ignored a real country. We treated it as a kind of a proxy. The United States treated it as a platform for fighting Russia. It walked away from the scene, it abandoned it, and it did it without any thought. And the new administration coming in basically didn't have any greater interest either. In fact, they had less interest probably in the affairs of Afghanistan. They wanted to retreat from places they didn't think were strategically important. And what you really have is a period of ineptitude in foreign policy in the Clinton administration, and I think the Afghan case is absolute proof of it, followed by a period of ineptitude in the Bush administration, which is still carrying on. And I fear to say what's happened since, and this is really like since the end of the Cold War, we've had 15 years of ineptitude in American foreign policy, where successive governments have felt that their obligation is to their party rather than to the interest of the country. And we in the media have a lot to answer for as well. We didn't monitor events in this somewhat out-of-the-way place. The U.S. government didn't care. But on the whole, if the U.S. government doesn't care, we should be asking ourselves the question, is there something that they're omitting or avoiding that we should be paying attention to? The media should be the watchdogs. And secondly, we didn't explore the relationship between the Taliban and bin Laden, and we still haven't done it in a thorough enough way, and I'd like to say that this book may be one of the first attempts to do that very thing. Instead, when the Bush administration claimed that the Taliban were illegal combatants, unlawful combatants, and therefore were not entitled to the protection of the Geneva Convention, journalists did not come out with a story about what happened in the war, where they really were lawful combatants. It was a government of sorts fighting an opposition, and they were fighting, and they were doing something that was lawful under any international